So if I could welcome up to the platform, we're going to be talking about funding the aircraft and engine orders for the next decade or so. Just in order that they appear on here, Ron Kent, who's Managing Director of Marketing for Asia Pacific for Boeing. Joost van der Heijden, who's Head of Airline Marketing, Africa, India, Southeast Asia and Japan for Airbus. There's a man who gets to travel. And last but certainly not least, Donal Boylan, who's CEO of Hong Kong Aviation Capital. Donal. I'm not going to say very much, we're just pretty much straight into the panel, but just to briefly set the scene for some of the issues that we're looking at in this region. We've talked about the enormous potential for expansion of the market here in Northeast Asia, particularly because there's been very little development until now. Oh, oh my gosh, how could I forget you, Adam? My apologies. Please give me a big hand. Oh, yeah. Yes, now I haven't got you on. What's that? Oh, sorry, Doctor. Oh, good. I was just wondering why there was a spare seat there. But very well filled there. Sorry for that. Yeah, so one of the things, and I mentioned this before, we've got this region well over 1,000 orders just from aircraft orders just from low-cost airlines alone, if we include India as part of this region. And that is a real transformation of the picture of the way it was, say, 10 years ago, where all the ordering was coming from the incumbent airlines who had a long track record, usually big reputations, in some cases with government funding support or government support of one kind or another. It's a whole new environment, in other words, in terms of the type of entity, many of them private, which are going to be buying aircraft and somehow having to repay the debt or raise equity to make sure they can stay there. This is happening, of course, at the same time as we have a debt crisis, particularly in Europe, and potentially even getting worse, and a very, very somber situation in the United States, to the extent that most of the lenders have become very risk averse. It's hard to get them to open their wallets to lend money these days. So you've got those two different but converging, perhaps negatives in terms of the traditional market for funding aircraft and engines. And in those circumstances, particularly when the traditional lenders are in Europe and in North America, we don't really have a well-developed aviation funding community in this region who understands the way things are in this region, because it's different from everywhere else. It's growing much faster. It's exciting, but it's also apparently much higher risk. So in those circumstances, how do we ensure the future? How do we ensure that the almost certain potential aviation traffic growth is catered to by allowing these airlines to expand and to buy the aircraft that they provide? So that's all I'm going to say in terms of introduction. I know we have a number of different points that we can go through, and I think some healthy differences of opinion, perhaps, but also some areas of convergence, and even a bit of disruption. Something that we were just talking about before. Anna, maybe you could, just to kick it off, comment on what I was just saying, or give your views of where the market situation is at the moment from a banker's point of view.
Yeah. With the way the markets are, you've got to ask yourself, how are all these aircraft going to be funded? Because the number of deliveries well exceeds the number of aircraft deliveries we had pre-crisis, so before the GFC. And the GFC has led to such a huge disruption in the funding markets that we've almost doubled our problems. So if we go through the markets which were providing the most amount of financing pre-crisis, and then look at them post-crisis, we'll start to make people's eyes water. I mean, pre-crisis, we were looking to fund, call it $50 to $60 billion a year. Most of it was being funded in the commercial debt markets, a small piece in the ECA markets, call it 15%. The operating lessors, funded largely by the commercial banks, were doing a good chunk. And we had a bit of tax equity and bits and bobs here and there, some private equity, and then the airlines own resources. Eventually, we used to get to $50, $60 billion with very low cost financing. What do we have next year? We have more than $100 billion. So the funding ask has doubled. The commercial debt markets, in terms of syndication, that market is broken. The European sovereign crisis is not getting resolved anytime soon.
Hopefully.
They've got a lot of things to sort out, more than just worrying about funding aircraft. And so if we assume that the commercial banks, which were funding $20 billion, even pre-crisis, even if we can at a stretch assume they will do the same now, we would have expected them to double. They're not. They'll be lucky to be flat, probably down. The operating lessors, who are depending on commercial banks, want to fund more. Let's come back to the operating lessors. The export agencies, the export finance agencies, the ECA, they have picked up the slack. So they've gone from funding $8 billion to funding more than $20 billion, probably coming up to 2025. But then that still leaves a very large gap for next year. And that gap, if the ECAs can't plug it, will have to be funded by the capital market, the bond market. The bond markets would be happy to fund that gap if the airlines had ratings. The airlines haven't got those ratings. So who will plug the gap? Probably it will be plugged to some degree by the ECAs, if you can push them to 25 billion. I don't think they want to go there. Or by the lessors. The lessors all got ratings. They're all in the market raising bonds, like going out of fashion. And they could probably pick up a lot of the slack. So do we move from a market which is 35% operating lease to a market which is more like 40 to 50%? Probably that's the way we have to go.
Yeah, that is a pretty scary scenario, I've got to say. Donal, do you have the same optimistic outlook?
I was going to leave, actually, but I think it's important to say, and Anup and others have eloquently described it, yes, the requirement for aircraft financing has doubled in the last few years, and indeed from last year to this year we've gone from 77 to almost 100 billion. So it's a very acute time right now in this coming 12 to 15 months. Absolutely, the tide is low for bank availability, commercial debt availability. But I've listened for many years to the manufacturers and Boeing and Airbus, and usually at the end of each year, everybody breathes a sigh of relief and said, you know what, everything got financed. Some way we did it, and I think Anup also alluded to that. Bits and bobs he talked about, someone comes up. But basically, financing will come at a price. And maybe I'll throw out maybe 2 or 3 things which people can think about. The first one is slightly controversial, which is, okay, we're contracted to buy aircraft. Next year it'll be $100 billion. We could simply go back to the old model of 50 billion if Boeing and Airbus would like half the price of all the aircraft. That's a very simple way of solving it. But of course, That's not good for their business model. And to be very fair to both manufacturers, in many aircraft models, by having long production cycles, and for lessors, the most popular aircraft have been the A320 family and the Boeing 737 new generation. Essentially, many of those aircraft are delivering in real terms at the price they were selling for almost 10 years ago. Boeing and Airbus are both making aircraft more cheaply because all of the non-recurring costs has been paid off. So certainly, having aircraft models that have long sustained lives, and which means that at the point of their launch, they need to be very innovative, so they're good airplanes for 20 or 30 years, reduces the overall cost. And that's important to note, because if we take the most ubiquitous aircraft, the most popular aircraft of the late 80s and early 90s, the 737 Classic, as it was then, you had little more than 1,500 aircraft made. Today, Boeing is heading over 4,000 with the new gen, and Airbus, essentially 5,000 with the A320 family. So that's a positive. In terms of a very simple piece of logic, manufacturers will only deliver aircraft so long as somebody pays for them. So why are we worried about financing? If the aircraft cannot be paid for, it ain't leaving the factory. And ultimately, if enough aircraft are white tails, the manufacturers will make less of them. And therefore, the airlines who remain in the market will make more money because they have less competition. So it's a supply and demand thing. Right now, the problem is too many aircraft have been manufactured. And I will criticize the manufacturers. They've been too greedy. It suits me as a leasing company to say, and some of my competitors would agree, that if you start a leasing company and you go and visit a manufacturer, he will do a very intensive due diligence on you, and he might allow you to buy 25 aircraft. If you start an airline in the Congo tomorrow and you put $2 million of equity into it, you can order 100 aircraft. And that is not something that the manufacturers did 20 years ago. And so I think this balance of taking huge orders, which will never deliver, it's almost like airlines saying, you know what, I'm very happy to sell 150 seats in a 120-seat airplane, because I know half the passengers won't show up on the day. That's yield management. Well, Airbus and Boeing have played poker and yield management, and I won't say which one has played it more than the other, but they have. And there are certain airlines out there in the marketplace that have very large orders, that don't have the capability to purchase them, to deliver them, and they will defer and they will fail to deliver. So the problem is not as big as we think it is.
Obviously a number of very, very interesting points in there, Donal. One of them, or two of them particularly, struck me. One about the supply and demand. I mean, the supply and demand is a supply and demand between the purchaser of an aircraft and the supplier of an aircraft. That doesn't relate to the demand in the marketplace to travel. Therefore, the real issue, I guess, for most of the people here is, will that demand be met? But the other one I'd like to pick up too is Anoop's comment that is suggesting that perhaps we'll move from 30 to maybe 40 or 45% purchasing by lessors. Is that something that you see as well as a sort of release valve?
It's already happened. On the aircraft models, everybody talks that leasing is 35% market penetration. Leasing in the core 100 to 200 seat single aisle market is already 50% penetration. In the large regional jet market, Embraer are up at 35% with the E-Jet, and Bombardier, have a different product that maybe is, has been less popular in recent times, and they have the C-Series on the way, but the CRJ 700 and 900 are down at around the 10 to 12% penetration with lessors. And that tells you a salutary lesson that lessors look at the successful aircraft in terms of market spread and everything else, and they will follow successful airplanes. When you move up to twin-aisle airplanes, twin-aisle two-engined airplanes, A330s, 50s, 787, right up to 777. Penetration is in the marketplace is around the 30% level. Slightly higher in the A330, near 40%, lower in the bigger models. But when you go up clearly to 747, A380, it's a pretty much non-existent market, except for, call it, the Doric type tax activity. So lessors for aircraft that are physically mobile, that are financially liquid, that are simple to transfer, that have lots of customers and geographic spread and segment spread, low-cost carriers, charter operators, etc., right down to primary scheduled and secondary market carriers, they will facilitate that. I think the challenge for the manufacturers and indeed the marketplace is, can we get enough standardization in large long-haul airplanes that will encourage people to take risk and have 100% ownership in those aircraft? And both Boeing and Airbus's statistics will show you that the economic lives of wide bodies is below 20 years in terms of valuable returns, and for single-aisle aircraft is higher. So that's the reality for people.
Well, Ron, this leads into a point we were talking about before we started this session of the portability of aircraft and the standardization, the ability of someone actually to be able to sell an aircraft quickly if they need to because and that is the elements involved in the saleability of that aircraft obviously are, is it something that can quickly be used by somebody else? If it's an orphan, can it be put into another fleet? How do you sort of move towards standardization? Ron, you answer the question.
So yeah, that's what we believe is attractive to lessors is portable aircraft that can plug and play just in any airline, and that's why when we developed 737, single engine type, different thrust ratings with the exact same engine, is capable of all thrust ratings, and so you can have it leased out in one place, and when that lease is up, you can put that airplane somewhere else very simply. That makes it much more of an asset that can be looked at as, instead of having to look at the value of the airline when you're financing it, you can look at the value of the asset. That way you're investing in that airplane, not necessarily in that airline.
Right.
So portability and standardization are really key. One of the things difficulties with standardization is every airline will tell you that they want standardization as long as it's their standard. And they can't come to an agreement on what standardization means.
Well, does this shortage of funding actually put greater pressure on an airline to accept the need for standardization?
Well,
not just the way I want it, but the way everybody wants it.
That when you have a standardized product in terms of the airplane, it makes it a bit more difficult for the airline to differentiate themselves. And so that's where lots of standardization can take place, but where you're going to have differentiation, that's where they're going to push back on that standardization, whether they're financing that airplane or not. And we've had cases where some of the investors, the leasing companies, working with the airlines will require certain things on an airplane because they know that they're going to have to place that airplane somewhere else. And it may be something that the airline doesn't want, but the lessor is going to say, if we're going to finance that, you have to have this on your airplane. So there's a little bit of the investor in getting in on that and doing that. As far as the financeability and the problems that you're having over the next year, we tend to take a longer look, and that is that there is a demand for travel. We've all talked about the travel, what Asia Pacific is, and how that's the largest growing market. Boeing forecasts at 6.4% over the next 20 years. And that means that the airlines are going to need almost 8,000 single-aisle airplanes in that time frame. Blips and difficulties with financing will happen, but those 8,000 planes are going to be required to travel for those passengers to travel. So we expect that there's going to be ways to finance that eventually. And the lessors are stepping up. We're getting substantially more activity from the lessors.
We are, though, aren't we? I mean, quite apart from the standardisation and portability, we are entering a period in time now where you've got a major shift. We're shifting away from the European and American financiers because they're in trouble, where at the same time seeing rapidly, very, very rapidly, perhaps unprecedentedly rapidly, increase the number of orders from this region. I mean, those two things.
You mean from the leasing companies?
Well, no, I'm just talking about demand from the airlines themselves wanting to meet their potential market demand. In those circumstances, it's harder, isn't it, to look at the long term, as you were saying. You've got some really exceptional short-term issues to get right.
True. Yes, and there are that we do have difficulties from time to time of getting airplanes financed, and airlines sometimes have to scramble to get a leasing company to step up. But I think you mentioned earlier that a lot of it has to do with pricing. I mean, maybe you can get financing, but you may not get financing at the pricing that you like. So when we have difficulty, that's an added cost to a low-cost airline that they may have to, for a short period of time, take some financing that's not as good as when there's more capital available to finance those airplanes.
Yeah, that's going to be a challenge. Yes, Steve, scribbling away.
Yeah, there's a lot of subject have been mentioned. So I thought I'd just note them down so that I wouldn't.
Can you just respond in 30 seconds, please?
So one of the points was mentioned was standardization. Certainly something that everybody recognizes as a value for lessors and investors. It facilitates moving aircraft around. Can have a value for the manufacturer as well because it can reduce unit costs, so it gives more pricing flexibility. It allows higher profitability. On the engines, certainly I think it's become easier. The recent engines, there are changes with often. They're interchangeable and so on. It's not a completely new step. Of course, with aircraft like the Neo, it will be different, but that's by far outweighed by the efficiency gains that you'll get for that. So I think everybody is in favor of such an engine change. But then you have to find a balance as well. You have to find a balance with the needs and the requirements of the airlines. Because, for example, offering an engine choice will allow competition between the engine manufacturers, will allow to reduce the pricing, will allow to create a bigger market base for the planes. And it's the same for customization. It's easier on the single aisle side, especially with the growth of the low-cost carriers. You have, from a cabin point of view, quite similar products in terms of configuration. But on the wide-body end, there will need to be every airline has its own identity, branding, so many different markets, products, how you can position yourself. There will need to be customization. You have to find the right balance because this kind of customization will again allow to attract more customers, create a bigger customer base, place more aircraft into the marketplace, and that's key for financing residual value as well, that an aircraft has a broad market base and a broad customer base. So it's a balance as well as on the wide-body side with 350 and 787. We're looking at ways to introduce more standardization into the aircraft. So that's on the standardization. On the financing, it's Donal mentioned it. It's something that comes up regularly. There is very consistent growth in the industry. Traffic doubles every 15 years. The fleet roughly as well. So the subject of financing and how the increased number of aircraft requires more financing comes up very regularly, especially in times of economic challenges like we are today. As you said as well, we do make it work. On the manufacturer side, We don't do aircraft financing, but we work with partners to find the right solutions for the airlines, and we do find the solutions. We do find the solutions in the up end of the economic cycle, and as well today. What we do see is that not so much the sourcing of the financing. There will be obviously cash, there will be commercial debt, there will be ECAs, there will be we'll be working with lessors to put in place sale and leasebacks, finance leases. That will remain very similar. We do see the shift in the source of the financing from the commercial banks side, where because of the challenges in Europe as well in the US, you see China coming in a lot more as well as Japan. Japan is quite recent, but we see a lot more sourcing coming from Japan. And then there is I will mention it, the innovative solutions, more innovative solutions like bond issues, as we saw recently on the A380, used as a collateral by Doric in the US, Emirates aircraft, where I think for the first time a non-European aircraft with a non-European operator attracted very successfully financing in the US in such an innovative structure. So we do try and find solutions, and I think the sector is innovative as well to cover the needs going forward. In terms of production and references to overproduction and selling too many aircraft, or producing too many aircraft. I certainly don't agree with that, as you would expect. The demand for new aircraft is very strong. I make reference to the number of aircraft that will be required in the coming years. We both issued our forecast for the market, and we find relatively similar figures in terms of requirements. And when you look at the backlogs, there is still considerable open demand. In terms of production, when you look at the orders over the last 5 years, we gained 4,500 orders. We delivered 2,500 aircraft. So we're certainly not producing more than the market requires. The market demand is actually much more than what we can produce at the moment. When you look at the deliveries, you can see that we have increased deliveries over the last years, but very gradually. There's definitely not a big step up in deliveries as big orders come in. We monitor that very carefully, and we are quite conservative in the way we increase production. It's very well in line with what the market needs. And you have to know that below the surface there's a lot going on. I mean, it's a very dynamic market. The challenges in various areas of the world. Other areas are doing much better. We work with our customers to manage their capacity needs. Some will want to move some aircraft back sometimes, and many will want to move them forward. Below the surface, there's a lot going on. But the overall result is a conservative increase in production. We certainly don't feel that as.
I think that's to some extent borne out, isn't it, by the demand, the passenger demand figures in this region particularly. Even with the production or with the orders now in place, and assuming perhaps an accelerated rate of passing the aircraft through it than by acquiring younger aircraft, which is what the low-cost carriers in this region tend to do. We have a younger profile of low-cost carrier fleets here. That just matching the number of seats that are going to be available with the potential demand, albeit at a lower cost, lower price, looks to be pretty much where the market needs it. And the real issue is can they be funded at that level? Just one interesting thing in terms of airlines themselves not being able to make a bond issue because the market's not there. To what extent is the, I gather, the likelihood of Japan Airlines IPO getting away, is that going to be a positive thing for the market?
I think that there's been a number of IPOs which have happened in the last few years with Tiger, in Cebu Pacific, in Garuda, the US, you've had Spirit. So I think that the Japan Airlines IPO will get away. It will be different from the others which I mentioned, which were largely distributed to the institutions. The JAL IPO will largely go retail, which is a unique aspect of the Japanese market, and very unique for the aviation industry, which, as you were telling me, you wouldn't be putting airline stocks in your portfolio, but the institutions will invest for you. But in Japan, the retailers will buy that stock.
Are you sort of implying that's a little bit like the Facebook IPO?
That's not for me to say, Peter.
You did have a similar profile,
but no, I think that the underwriters for that issue will be looking at the fact that it is going retail, and I suppose they will be cognizant and aware of that. But could a number of other North Asian carriers or Asian carriers come out to the equity markets and say, we've got this very large order, give us the money, and we're having difficulty raising debt? That's not a good story for the equity markets. The equity markets aren't funding aircraft. The equity markets are funding what they see as airlines who have a growth story, but are already making it work profitably. So the airlines IPOs which have been successful thus far, let's just talk about Spirit and Cebu Pacific, Tiger, Garuda. The equity market doesn't want to buy a story which is a dream. They basically want you to come in with at least, let's talk about an LCC 2025 aircraft. You go to the market and say, I am already generating with this fleet of 2025 aircraft a EBITDA margin in excess of 25%, typically 25-30%. And I'm generating a net profit after tax margin of 10 to 12%. And I'm doing that with the 25 units I have. And by the way, I've ordered another 50. And with each additional unit, I hope to do the same. And the equity market will buy that story. Where the equity market is unhappy is the carrier in the Congo with 2 million equity raised and an order book of 100 aircraft, and they say, well, the bank markets don't want to fund me. Why don't you give me the cash, and we will don't worry, we will do very well by your cash. That doesn't sell for equity. Equity is public equity in aviation wants to see profitable growth. The bond markets, on the other hand, are different. They will look at aircraft values. The WTC market is well established. Aircraft secured bonds are well established. But the WTC market looks at a single obligor.
Looks at
a single obligor, which is the underlying airline. So they want to know that that airline will generate cash flows, and those cash flows will pay off the bond debt. And they will look to the aircraft to give them security, the collateral which they need. And their return expectations are very different from equity, they're much lower. So the aircraft counts, but the first thing which counts is those cash flows. And those cash flows, for the bond investors to understand them, each bond investor is not going to do a financial model which tells them what the risk rating of the airline is. They need a rating agency to have done that beforehand. Yeah. That rating agency to then look at the pool of aircraft which the airline wants and then rate the transaction. So the starting point has to be the airline cash flows, and they have to be rated. The airlines in Asia have been very, very reluctant to get ratings. Where we do have rated airlines, they've tended, let's say in Japan, the 2 airlines are rated. We've got Qantas, who is rated. But by and large, the other high-grade, very large Asian carriers, even with very large orders, have been reluctant to get ratings. And so their reluctance to get ratings has put them in a situation, or will put them in a situation next year, that they will go towards the bond market, towards the operating lessors. And as Donal mentioned, and I think that the prediction, if Donal wants to provide one for next year, is probably 60% up to 2/3 of narrow bodies may go to the lessors.
And have the lessors got the capability to absorb that, Donal?
No.
Or the willingness, the wish to?
Lessors have the willingness, but it is a cycle. They depend on commercial banks and capital markets and so forth. So no, it's not going to change that rapidly. I think certain aircraft types, Anoop is right, lessors will go for quality as they see it, meaning those standard aircraft, and for the better names. And it's interesting what we've seen in the market in the last 3 to 6 months. We've seen a flood of RFPs from airlines, like twice as many, say, as the previous 6 months. We've seen quality of airlines, people who probably wouldn't have talked to us a year ago are now actually sending us RFPs. Thirdly, they are telling us that the first aircraft is delivering in November, not in 9 months' time. So it's sending an awful lot of signals that the airlines have, either planning-wise or otherwise, not left themselves in a difficult situation. Now, there are unique circumstances. There are people that start up a project, accelerate it, and come to the market with something quickly. But when you see an airline that's around in business for 50 years and has an order for 5 or 6 years, and they're coming, we had a European flag carrier come to us with an RFP for an aircraft delivering in 7 weeks' time. So that sort of behaviour suggests that airlines have had planning problems. But I think if we could jump away a little bit and say, there's a lot of doom and gloom here. Let's talk about some of the positives for the airline sector, and particularly in Asia. It's a growth area, there's no doubt about it. More and more people are traveling. That's why people are forming airlines and ordering aircraft. And people are trying in the airline industry to anticipate, because aircraft take 1 or 2 or 3 years to build, and they take several years to order. So people have to take a certain amount of risk. The problem is when you take a market maybe like India, when everybody decided to order aircraft at the one time, but the infrastructure wasn't there, and you can't have 5 airlines all doubling their capacity. So there are issues about discipline. However, the airline industry as a whole has performed so excellently over the last 10 years in the sense that aircraft are now being utilized at rates that we never saw before, efficiency-wise. Crews are now trained with simulator technologies much less expensively than they were before, and there's multi-type ratings so guys can hop from one type to the other. Maintenance intervals and reliability, thank you to the manufacturers, but also some of the airline practices and the monitoring and IT that's out there, they've expanded. So maintenance costs have come down, albeit some maybe materials and that are more expensive. The insurance industry has done nothing for us. It's got more expensive. They scare the wits out of everybody, so they need to be screwed a little bit. Direct operating costs, distribution, airlines and internet sales, have generally done a super job. So what has happened? Why hasn't the airline industry, its fuel has nailed them to the cross over the last 5 years. The airline industry can now break even at basically 80, 85 bucks a barrel of oil. 10 years ago, they could only break even at $20. And there's not a sense that fares have increased. It's actually airlines have brought down their cost right across the board, and they are performing at an excellent rate. So why aren't airlines more profitable so ANOOP's rating agencies can give them ratings? There's 2 or 3 reasons why. The first reason is probably airlines sell fares too cheap, and that's the expectation of the public. When I fly from Paris to London, I pay, with a low-cost carrier, €50 for a ticket. When I land in London, I've got to pay a drunk taxi driver £50 to drive me to the centre of London. It just doesn't make sense. The shipping industry and the rail industry are not privatised. Please show me the rail companies and the shipping companies that people actually want to buy shares in. They're all state-owned, regulated, they're not fined if they arrive late, they haven't got security regulation, all of those issues. So the airline industry actually needs to lobby harder to say that they need to be on a par with these other industries. Regulate everybody else the way we are. But in terms of this rating agency scenario, ANOOP is absolutely right that airlines have suffered because they're not very profitable. They've also suffered for a second reason, because they've got a lot of capital employed in aircraft, and therefore they're perceived to be very highly leveraged. And the third issue is that the people who are in the rating agencies, guess where they come from? They all worked in banks. So who are the people that have lost all the money in the last 5 years? I come from a very small country, Ireland, 4 million people. We've got 2 airlines, both of whom are profitable, Ryanair and Aer Lingus. We've one bank in the country that managed to write off 35 billion and write off the whole economy. And so that bank had a AA rating. Neither of the airlines could ever have gotten that rating. And I suppose it's down to how things are judged. So if, as an industry, I would give 3 takeaways here today. 1, let's get a couple of airline guys into Fitch, Standard & Poor's and so forth, and work in getting the ratings sorted out. Secondly, on fuel burn, let's beat up the air traffic management sector. Why are flights that took 1 hour 10, 20 years ago taking 1 hour 20 minutes today? And in the biggest market nearby to us, mainland China, a military controlled airspace, any airline that operates to say Beijing will tell you that their sectors start in the morning on time and they end up 2 hours late at night, and it's all down to air traffic control. And I think the third area that is key for the airline sector is one of educating the markets on why this is a cash flow business as opposed to a balance sheet business. And that is why for lessors, we're attracted to it. We can deploy assets for 20 years and there are cash flows and we can move them around. The rating agencies and the banks don't understand that, but when you isolate it and you put it into a leasing company, they're quite happy to give you a rating.
Certainly a lot of food for thought there, I would have to say, particularly at this time of the evening on a Friday. But I suspect there might be 1 or 2 questions from the audience in terms of where we've travelled so far. Am I right in suspecting that? I'm sure you've got a lot, don't be shy. And there's got one, sorry, down the end here, Andrew.
Thank you. Andrew Cowan from Mango. It was perhaps less a question, just a contribution really to some of the points that Donal was making. There was a very interesting statistic that came out from the American Air Transport Association that highlighted that if you took the American airlines as a whole, out of all the revenue they made, only 70 cents of that revenue was profit, but $25 of the $100 that they took away in taxes. Okay, so to really add to what Donal said, I think one of our other big issues is to somehow take the costs of, should we say the government costs, which is taxes, regulation. We talked about safety. Take all of these things out of the equation, because they're burdening the industry and making the industry harder to execute, and that makes travel and all the good things about travel much harder to do. So really just to endorse some of those points.
Trouble is, it ain't going to happen.
We've got to work on it all together, I think.
Yeah, that's
Peter,
rise up.
It's such a valid point. I recently brought my family out to this part of the world, and I smiled because I had so much frequent flyer mileage they were coming for nothing until I did the taxes. And it was actually, the taxes were more expensive than the fare net of taxes that I could have bought from the airline. So, that'll illustrate just how bad it's got, particularly in Western Europe.
It's also what a rip-off frequent flyer programs are becoming. But,
If I may, because we were talking a lot about the financing side. And as I mentioned, we have always found solutions for the financing. I'm confident we will. We're in the most exciting region of the world in terms of aviation, in terms of growth, in particular for the low-cost segment that we're focusing on here. The sector has seen over 25% growth in the last 5 years. We're confident that that can continue, maybe not at more than 25%, but as we heard yesterday from Jetstar, 10-12%, probably more, and that is more than sufficient to accommodate the aircraft on order. From Airbus side, we have more than 800 aircraft with low-cost carriers still in the backlog, actually. But if you look at the fleet plans and the rollovers in combination with the growth, that works, and there's potential for more. But as it was highlighted, beyond the financing, there are many other key issues that I think are probably much more important to solve to facilitate the further growth. It was mentioned over the last 2 days. It is the continued liberalization. The Asian open skies is key. Further opening of, in particular, China in North Asia. Also the infrastructure development. We've seen a lot of beautiful airport and low-cost terminal projects already put in place, but I think there's in places like India, Indonesia, there is still a lot to do. That will need to be addressed, as well as air traffic management, the airspace in India and in China. We need to do a lot to allow the airspace to facilitate the growth that we see. And I think, as Andrew mentioned correctly, the taxation structure as well is something that needs to be addressed. So there's a lot more issues that go beyond the financing and the aircraft and the organization of the carriers that need to be addressed. Of course, from the manufacturer side, we try to build the lowest cost aircraft that we can. But it's not only about that; it's also about making sure that turnaround times can be as short as possible, that the aircraft are reliable to achieve the highest utilization possible. And I think from the manufacturer's side, I think what is as important in order to make the sector, and there are large deals out there. I think the potential is there, and what we do with the airlines in Asia is really create a very close partnership. And I think with a lot of the low-cost carriers, we have been there from the start. AirAsia, Indigo, Cebu, and it's really about trust between the airline and the manufacturer, and us believing in their model and then believing that we can deliver the right planes, and that's what makes it work as well.
Agree with that, Rob?
Yeah, I think that we are constantly trying to manufacture and design airplanes to reduce those costs. I mean, the low-cost carriers have been driving to get all of their other costs down substantially, and again, the 737 has extremely the highest reliability, and that's why moving to a new airplane was one of the things that we were looking at but decided not to do. And we can maintain that high reliability, that reduces the costs and increases the utilization for the low-cost carriers. And also, the re-engining of the 737 is something that the airlines asked us for, to, instead of a new airplane 5 years later, bring us the re-engined airplane, because we need that cost reduction as quickly as possible. In addition to that, even when instead of block points like the MAX, the NG over 10 years has reduced fuel burn by 6% just within that model alone. And so we're constantly improving those airplanes to reduce the cost to the operators. And so we look for the lightest weight per seat airplane for the lowest fuel burn. And I think that's what the low-cost carriers need, and that's what helps them become successful. It's certainly not the only thing. They've got all these other issues that they have to work in terms of trying to reduce their costs there. But we take a look at the market, and we don't look at large orders for an airline and say, you know, can they take them? Certainly we look at every airline as to whether or not they can, but we look at the market, and the market needs these airplanes, and so we know that there's a place for these airplanes. But again, I think from a manufacturer's perspective, we're doing as much as we possibly can to try to reduce those costs, because the airlines are seeing their revenues, their yields going down, and they have to have the costs go down at the same time.
Just picking on one particular US point, the US airlines have been fairly vocal just recently about funding foreign aircraft purchases through the credit agencies. I mean, is that an issue that's going to gain political traction, or do you see continued expansion and support for foreign borrowing?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, we had the one instance where Delta would made a case, and that went away, and so I think that probably isn't going to be a major issue that we have coming forward. The financing, that type of financing is less expensive financing, and I think you mentioned before that the credit agencies or the export agencies don't actually finance the airplanes, they just guarantee the financing, which makes it less expensive to finance. So again, we're talking about lower cost financing, and it's a cost item as opposed to the ability to be financed.
Totally.
So I think that's probably not as big of an issue.
But in Europe, Joost, are they becoming more less willing to support aircraft sales, particularly European credit agencies?
Well, I'm not a financing man, so I'm not close to what the details of who does what, but usually Europe has its challenges, and the banking sector is an important factor in that. So it certainly has an effect on the appetite for financing. But as I said earlier, what we see is that this is picked up by financing possibilities in other parts of the world, like China and Japan. So it's a cyclical thing, and we're fortunate that we have a global industry, which helps on the value and the placement facilitation of the planes, and it helps for the financing side as well, where we can really tap into financing from all all the regions of the world.
And I guess that really is the underlying issue that where I started from anyway when we started this discussion. That is expanding and even establishing and expanding the facilities in this region to look after its own, as opposed to having to rely on the older systems in the US and Europe. And that's really, I guess, going to be a critical issue, not necessarily for the next 5 minutes, but certainly for the next 5 and 10 years. And that's probably in a lot of ways one of the positives that might come out of it, that there is going to be greater pressure on the Asian financiers to look much more closely at the opportunities here. And if they do look much more closely, they may find there are some really good opportunities, particularly because they understand the Asian markets.
Well, we've seen the Asian banks step up more than they have, and they're just starting to get into it, especially the Chinese banks. So we expect that there's going to be a lot more financing in that arena than there has been in the past.
Yeah. Is that a hope or a reality, do you think?
I think that just at the point of the financial crisis in the year that followed, we all hoped that China would replace the role of the Japanese in the 90s and the Germans in the 2000s. But the Chinese didn't do so. They stepped back, they saw that the banks elsewhere had their issues, and they were much, much more cautious when lending to overseas airlines. And I think that the Asian lenders in general, they're reticent with doing very long-term dollars. They have great liquidity in their local currencies, but the aircraft asset remains a US dollar asset. It's efficient that way. And the Asian lenders didn't want to do long-term financings when they were getting their own funding short-term, which is intelligent, considering what happened in the financial crisis. I think that they will get investment-grade aircraft secured bonds. They can issue those bonds. The bond market will fund $25 billion tomorrow, and so they can get financing.
So nice, reasonably positive. And do you agree with Donal, or with Donal's hope anyway, that there might be some recognition that this is a different sort of business, it's a cash flow business, and therefore, it needs an attitudinal shift if you really are going to recognise the opportunities as a banker in this process?
I think that the cash flows are important, and if cash flows are consistent, then balance sheets will be strong. So I don't think the agencies are completely wrong. However, I do agree with Donal that an attitude does need to shift. Today, 16 airlines around the globe are rated. 10 of those are US airlines. If we had more Asian airlines rated and they formed a majority or a significant number, then I think that the rating agencies would stop looking at the world from a US prism.
Yeah. The one that we understand, we'll rate. Do I have another question? I know it's getting late now and I don't want to...
Just more of an observation than a question. We're actually very lucky to be in this region because as financiers, we have relatively strong regional banking support for our customers. As it has been noted, China has been more than capable of funding its own domestic deliveries. The Japanese have been kind enough to continue to support deliveries to ANA JAL. During times of crisis, KDB, Korean Exim has stepped up to support Korea. And of course, down in Singapore, the customer is more than capable of funding itself in the international market. So I think you need to not always discuss the issue from a global basis, although it has an impact on cost. Financing is available. In times of need, we're fortunate because our regional support steps into that breach. I think from a long-term perspective, fundamentally things have to change. And that's our message as a manufacturer to the industry, that it's not the standard 30% commercial bank, 30% ECA funding, 25% or so leasing company, and the balance on equity and capital markets. There has to be a shift, and I think that's been discussed today, into the capital markets and the bond agent and the bond market. So the sooner our customers in the region become comfortable with this change, they'll make that change. I don't think it's a reluctance, I think that's the word you used. It's they haven't had the need. The need is coming. I think we're all discussing that need. As they understand that need, they'll shift their business model to adapt. Because these are very successful airlines in our region. We're fortunate to be selling to them. I think we're fortunate to be leasing and to lending into these airlines. So it's a need, and as that need changes, they'll restructure, redefine themselves, and refocus to be successful.
Yeah, no, I hope you're right. Very much hope you're right, for their sakes too, in a lot of ways. Any other issues?
Over the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about the growth numbers and the number of passengers that will be flying and the number of new aircraft that are going to be put onto the market. What I'd like to ask the financiers is, how do they feel about the regulatory and infrastructure issues that are emerging throughout Asia, particularly in North Asia, with regard to airports, slots, air traffic management, government regulations, curfews, etc. As the number of aircraft increase dramatically, there's going to come a saturation point. Particularly, we're starting to see it in some parts of Asia now. And how do you feel about lending in this environment?
Well, I think there's a natural reaction to it. The problem is these things don't happen quickly. The manufacturers will demonstrate to us all that as each decade has passed on, the average aircraft size and seat numbers has increased. When I came into this business, the single aisle sector, was essentially 737-200 DC-9 or whatever, and it was 120 seat all economy. We then got the 300s as the center of gravity in the Classic, and it was 149, 150 seats. The A320, 800 NG is 180 seats. And I think we all recognize that the current center of gravity, even in the single aisle aircraft, is probably going to be closer to a 900 MAX or an A321neo next time around. So there's no doubt that size is one thing which just makes up for congestion. The second thing is, to be fair to the manufacturers, they have addressed technically with RVSM and radio frequencies and everything else, trying to find safe ways to fly aircraft closer together, etc. The advent of GPS and TCAS again has dealt with congestion in the skies. But those technologies can go so far, and I think really your question is not what are Boeing or Airbus or the airlines doing procedurally, but how do we as financiers feel when this is more about airports and air traffic management and all the congestion of security. And the problem with that is the people who make the decisions there are state, and it involves governments working together. And I do think there's one big positive emerging, and it goes back in a linked topic to what Foster from Boeing just said about funding aircraft in Asia. First of all, financiers, charity begins at home. Chinese banks fund Chinese airlines, Korean airlines, and so forth. Secondly, as this market develops and as demand develops in the marketplace and the needs develop, what we are beginning to see in Asia with low-cost carriers who started to cross borders. We don't have a European Union where Ryanair can operate in 12 different countries freely, yet we have managed cooperatively something that is unthinkable in this industry, that we have the Jetsstars, the AirAsias, and others who are now operating cross-border in Asia. And I do think we're going to see intra-Asian cooperation by government and the sort of investment in infrastructure that's needed to develop trade relations in Asia itself. So everyone says this is, the Asian century, but people who've been saying that have been in Australia or the United States or Europe in terms of trade. And when you're European, you tend to look at that sort of focus of how does Asia impact my continent. But actually, this is about Asia right now. And I would believe that the sort of expenditure you've seen on 95 airports in China, for example, the rate of that expenditure in the last 10 years is a credit to the planning of some of the governments in the region. Some of the most sophisticated airports, passenger-friendly airports. We go down the road to Hong Kong here. I think it rates as one of the better airports globally to deal with. And as you know, they have a third runway coming along in the latter end of this decade. So infrastructure doesn't move quickly, governments don't move quickly, but I think the recognition is there. And I would be optimistic that around 2020, we will look back and say, Asia, has dealt with a lot of those infrastructural issues very well.
And I can't think of a better spot to end than that. Nice take-off note. Thank you very much indeed. Give them a big hand if you would. Thank you very much to our panel. I think we've covered an awful lot of ground there and raised a lot of negative issues, but I think underlying this there is a positive sentiment. We're in the right place in the world at the moment, so thank you very much.